In 2020, I moved into a quiet four-home neighborhood. In 2024, I became the HOA president, and a few months later, the HOA no longer existed. When I bought my home in 2020, the neighborhood looked almost too good to be true. Four newly built houses, no traffic, no noise, and no visible problems. It felt private, calm, and simple. Exactly what most people want when they buy a home. What I didn't realize at the time was that hidden inside the legal paperwork was one requirement that would later shape everything. This development was legally required to have a homeowners association. None of us wanted it. Not a single homeowner had asked. For an HOA, it wasn't created because of shared pools, private roads, or luxury amenities. It existed because the city demanded it during the approval process. The HOA wasn't a choice. It was a condition. From the beginning, everyone viewed it as a formality, something temporary, something that existed on paper but didn't reflect how we actually lived. Still, every month we paid our dues, $280 per household, quietly leaving our accounts for reasons most of us couldn't even explain clearly. The official reason was a small park located at the back of the development. On a site map, it looked like a shared green space meant for everyone. In reality, it felt more like the backyard of the last house on the lot. The land sat entirely on a floodplain, meaning it could never be developed or built on. Its estimated value was around $3,000 Canadian dollars, hardly enough to justify the costs attached to it. Yet because that land existed, the HOA existed. And because the HOA existed, we paid for insurance, maintenance, reserve funds, and administrative fees, all for something that almost no one used. From the very first conversation between neighbors, one thing was clear. If there was ever a legal and safe way to remove the HOA, we would take it. We weren't trying to avoid responsibility. We just didn't believe in paying indefinitely for something that gave us nothing in return. At the time, it felt like wishful thinking. HOAs don't usually disappear. They grow stronger, add rules, and gain power. But ours was small, fragile, and completely dependent on a single piece of land. We just didn't know yet that this land would become the key to everything. The entire HOA existed for one reason: a small park tucked behind the last house in the development. On paper, it was labeled as a community green space. In reality, it didn't feel like one. There were no benches, no playground equipment, and no walking paths. It wasn't a place where neighbors gathered or kids played. Most of the time, it sat empty, quietly blending into the yard of the house closest to it. There was another problem. The land sat on a designated floodplain. That single detail changed everything. Because of that classification, the park could never be developed, sold for profit, or improved in any meaningful way. Its estimated value was roughly $3,000 CAD, which made the ongoing HOA expenses feel increasingly absurd. Every month, we were paying for insurance, maintenance, and reserve contributions, all tied to that one piece of land. Over time, the math became impossible to ignore. We were spending far more maintaining the park than the land itself was worth. Eventually, the homeowner, whose property bordered the park, raised an idea that initially felt uncomfortable. What if they took ownership of the land? At first, the suggestion sounded risky. Giving a single homeowner control over what was technically community property can quickly turn into conflict. But instead of reacting emotionally, we slowed down and looked at the facts. The land was unusable. The HOA existed almost entirely because of it, and the homeowner already treated it like part of their yard anyway. To make sure everything was done properly, we hired a lawyer. A formal deed was drafted that limited how the land could be used. Access would be maintained, the space could not be developed for personal gain, and if the homeowner ever sold their house, the land could be transferred back. Every major concern was addressed in writing. There was another unexpected benefit. By transferring ownership of the park, the HOA could finally meet its emergency reserve requirements without increasing dues. One problem solved several others at once. When all four homeowners sat down to discuss it, there was no arguing, no power struggles, just logic. The proposal didn't benefit one person at the expense of the others. It benefited everyone. The vote was unanimous. With one signature, the HOA lost the very thing that justified its existence. And none of us realized yet that this decision had quietly set the stage for the HOA's eventual end. Here's a truth about small HOAs that most people don't talk about. Nobody wants to run them. Being HOA president isn't glamorous. There's no recognition, no paycheck, no sense of accomplishment. Instead, it's a constant stream of emails, forms, maintenance requests, and neighbor complaints. Every year, the same awkward conversation happens. Someone has to be president, but nobody volunteers willingly. In our development, this became a running joke. Every time the HOA board needed a president, someone would carefully forget or conveniently be out of town during the vote. Meetings were awkward, and the word volunteer felt more like a punishment than a choice. It was clear that this role, although technically necessary, was universally undesirable. Eventually, the rotation brought the role to me. I hadn't campaigned. I didn't lobby for it. I didn't even want the job. But it was my turn. And when I looked around, it was obvious. Someone had to take responsibility, or the HOA would continue existing in its inefficient, money-draining limbo. By the time I officially became president, the HOA had almost nothing left to manage. The park had been transferred, eliminating its largest expense. The only remaining community responsibility was a tiny strip of grass, technically located on my property. And yet, for years, the HOA had been paying a maintenance company to visit that small strip. Despite their minimum service fee, essentially, the company was getting paid to show up for a task that took mere minutes to complete manually. I already owned a riding mower. I realized that taking care of that strip myself would save everyone money, simplify the HOA's responsibilities, and make the role manageable. So I did it. The maintenance company was fired. I added that tiny section to my normal mowing routine, which added maybe 1 minute to my schedule each week. At that moment, a realization hit me. The HOA, stripped of the park and relieved of all major responsibilities, was already on life support. It existed purely out of habit and legal formality. There were no disputes, no big projects, no pressing obligations. The bureaucracy remained, but it was hollow. For the first time, I saw the opportunity clearly. The HOA could be ended legally, safely, and completely without harming anyone or putting the neighborhood at risk. All it needed was timing, proper planning, and a unanimous agreement among homeowners. And that's exactly what we were about to do. HOAs don't just vanish on their own. They exist because someone renews the contracts, collects the dues, and keeps the legal machinery running. And every year that renewal date arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, like a ticking clock that decides the future of the neighborhood. Most homeowners pay without thinking, signing the paperwork automatically, because that's how it's always been done. The process is simple, bureaucratic, and entirely mindless, unless someone chooses to question it. By the time the renewal approached for our HOA, it felt like a test. With the park gone, our responsibilities had shrunk to almost nothing. The only community maintenance left was the tiny strip of grass, which I personally managed. Our emergency reserve fund was fully funded, and there were no looming obligations or liabilities beyond that. For the first time, it became obvious that the renewal was optional, legally and practically. I gathered all 4 homeowners to discuss the upcoming renewal. The conversation was factual, calm, and focused. What would happen if we chose not to renew? Were there any legal risks or penalties? Could any essential obligations be overlooked? Step by step, we analyzed every possible scenario. The answers were clear. Without shared property, contracts, or ongoing maintenance, there was no real requirement to continue the HOA. The decision became even simpler when we considered the financial implications. Each household was paying $280 every month for something almost non-existent. Over the course of a year, that amounted to over $3,300 per household. Money essentially wasted on paperwork, minimal maintenance, and an empty green space. By choosing not to renew, that money would stay where it belonged, with the homeowners. The vote was quick and unanimous. There was no debate, no hesitation, no objections. We all understood the implications, and everyone agreed that ending the HOA was the most logical, responsible, and financially beneficial choice. It was astonishing how simple it felt. One small discussion, one careful review, one unanimous vote, and the HOA could cease to exist. The years of routine payments, the quiet resentment, and the bureaucratic burden could all disappear. The system that had quietly drained our pockets was about to be dismantled, and we would do it safely, legally, and with full control of the neighborhood's future. By the end of the meeting, it wasn't just a financial victory. It felt like liberation. The HOA had existed for years out of habit, not necessity, and now, finally, we could take control of our own homes. It was the first step toward reclaiming our independence, and it was exhilarating. When the renewal deadline passed, nothing exploded. There were no angry letters, no threats, and no official warnings. In fact, the silence was almost surreal. It felt as if time had slowed, and the world had paused for just a moment to let us realize what had happened. The HOA, the organization that had existed for years, controlling small aspects of our lives and draining money from our pockets, no longer existed. There was no board, no president, and no monthly dues. For the first time, we felt free of the invisible, tedious weight that had been placed on our shoulders from the very beginning. The tiny strip of grass remained, but it was now fully under my care, handled in minutes with no need for outside contractors. The shared emergency fund still existed, securely maintained in a third-party account, just in case any unexpected needs arose. Everything else that had once justified the HOA had vanished. The effect was immediate. Financially, each household went from $208 per month to zero, freeing up thousands of dollars over the course of a year. Mentally, there was a sense of relief that's hard to describe. No more emails about minor violations. No more worrying about dues. No more watching the clock to see when the maintenance company would show up. It was as if a burden we had carried unknowingly for years had suddenly lifted. We didn't celebrate with parties or fanfare. There were no speeches, no ceremonial ribbon cuttings. We simply acknowledged it quietly among ourselves and realized the magnitude of the decision we had made. Years of bureaucracy, unnecessary costs, and minimal oversight had been eliminated with a single deliberate action. In that moment, we understood just how fragile this system had been. The HOA had only survived for so long because everyone had accepted it without questioning its value. And yet there was a strange satisfaction in knowing we had done something most homeowners could only dream of. To legally dissolve an HOA, especially in a neighborhood where it was initially mandated, is no small feat. We had navigated legal agreements, ensured safeguards, and maintained a responsible reserve fund, all while avoiding conflict or risk. It was methodical, careful, and above all, effective. By the time we sat down after the paperwork was filed and deadlines passed, a sense of pride settled in. We had not only saved money, but also reclaimed control over our own homes. The HOA, which had once seemed permanent and inevitable, had been reduced to a memory. It was gone, and we were free. Looking back, the experience of dissolving our HOA was both surprising and educational. Many people assume that HOAs are permanent, unchangeable structures. They see the fees, the bylaws, and the board meetings and think, this is just how it has to be. What we learned is that most HOAs exist simply because no one questions them, not because they are necessary. Our first lesson was clear. Knowledge is power. Understanding the legal documents, the obligations, and the financial requirements gave us insight that most homeowners never bother to obtain. With just a few careful reviews, discussions, and consultations with a lawyer, we discovered that the HOA had far fewer obligations than we had assumed. Most of the rules, fines, and fees were enforceable only because the homeowners agreed to the system and continued funding it. Remove the payments and oversight, and the structure collapses. The second lesson, small changes can have huge consequences. Transferring the park's ownership seemed like a minor adjustment at the time. It was a single piece of land with minimal value and virtually no use. Yet that transfer effectively removed the central justification for the HOA's existence. One small, logical decision set the stage for eliminating an entire organization. It was a reminder that sometimes the key to solving a long-standing problem isn't a massive overhaul, and it's a targeted, well-planned action. Third, we learned the value of cooperation among neighbors. Without unanimous support, the plan could have easily failed. The trust and understanding between homeowners were essential. Open communication, transparency, and a willingness to act together allowed us to move quickly and decisively. This wasn't about fighting authority or exploiting loopholes. It was about acting collectively to reclaim resources and autonomy that were rightfully ours. Finally, the experience highlighted the difference between perceived obligations and actual obligations. The HOA existed in everyone's mind as a necessary part of home ownership. In reality, its responsibilities were almost non-existent after the park was transferred. Recognizing the difference allowed us to make confident decisions without fear of legal repercussions or community backlash. In the end, dismantling the HOA was more than a financial victory. It was a lesson in empowerment, strategy, and the importance of questioning systems that seem permanent. What seemed like an immovable, bureaucratic entity proved to be fragile when approached thoughtfully. And the benefits, financial freedom, less stress, and regained control, were immediate and tangible. One of the most immediate and noticeable benefits of ending the HOA was financial. Before, each household contributed $280 every month, totaling over $3,300 per year. That money disappeared quietly, with no visible return on investment. The HOA provided minimal maintenance, insurance coverage for a largely empty green space, and little else. Over time, it became clear that this recurring cost was draining resources for something almost non-existent. When the HOA ceased to exist, the savings were immediate. The money that had been quietly leaving our bank accounts stayed with the homeowners. For some, this allowed for home improvements. For others, it was simply extra disposable income. But beyond the numbers, the psychological relief was perhaps even more significant. Every time a bill arrived from the HOA, it reminded us of bureaucracy, rules, and obligations that provided little actual benefit. That reminder was gone. The monthly stress of accounting, payments, and paperwork evaporated. Beyond finances, the HOA's dissolution brought peace of mind. Without a governing body monitoring every minor infraction, homeowners could focus on their own lives without fear of letters, fines, or unnecessary meetings. Even small tasks, like maintaining the strip of grass, became manageable with minimal effort. I personally took over mowing that tiny strip in a matter of minutes, and it became part of my routine without inconvenience. The burden of coordinating maintenance, resolving disputes, or managing contracts simply disappeared. This newfound freedom allowed the neighborhood to function, more like a community and less like a corporate structure. People interacted voluntarily rather than out of obligation. Decisions about shared resources could be made informally, based on trust rather than rules enforced by a board. The tiny emergency fund we maintained ensured that nothing critical was neglected, yet there was no bureaucracy attached. It was a system that worked for the homeowners rather than the other way around. In short, the financial and emotional benefits of ending the HOA were profound. Money, previously lost to redundant fees, now stayed in the hands of the people who earned it. Stress and anxiety associated with unnecessary bureaucracy vanished. And most importantly, the neighborhood regained autonomy. Homeowners were in control of their homes again, not a distant governing body. This combination of freedom and responsibility created a sense of empowerment rarely experienced in modern home ownership. Looking back, one of the most critical factors in successfully ending our HOA was timing. The sequence of events, the park transfer, the emergency fund setup, and the approaching renewal deadline all aligned perfectly. Had we attempted this a year earlier, the HOA would have still had control over the park, and the financial and legal justification to exist would have been stronger. Had we waited longer, rules or obligations might have changed, or a new homeowner might have introduced complications. Timing, as it turns out, was everything. Opportunity presented itself in a way that required preparation and foresight. The park transfer was more than just a financial move. It was a strategic action that weakened the HOA's core. By removing its main asset, the justification for the HOA evaporated. This is an important lesson. Dismantling a system often requires identifying its foundation and addressing it directly. It is not about chaos or rebellion. It is about strategic thinking and acting decisively when the conditions are right. Another aspect of timing was psychological. Homeowners needed to be aligned, willing, and informed. There was no room for hesitation or half-hearted agreement. Each of the 4 homeowners had to understand the risks, benefits, and legal implications fully. When all parties were on board, the execution was swift and smooth. A delayed decision or lack of consensus could have stalled the process, allowing the HOA to continue its minimal but persistent existence. Furthermore, the legal deadlines associated with renewal worked in our favor. We were able to let the renewal pass without signing, which effectively terminated the HOA without confrontation or dispute. The system itself provided a natural exit point. We only had to recognize it and act. It was a reminder that understanding processes, deadlines, and regulations can create opportunities where others see barriers. In essence, the combination of preparation, strategy, and timing made what seemed impossible achievable. Without foresight, the HOA would still be collecting dues, managing the park, and exerting unnecessary control over our lives. With it, we achieved financial freedom, autonomy, and peace of mind, all while maintaining neighborly relationships and avoiding conflict. Timing transformed a potentially complicated legal process into a seamless, almost effortless victory for all involved. Another essential factor in successfully ending the HOA was trust among neighbors. Without full cooperation, the plan could have easily failed. Miscommunication, hesitation, or distrust could have resulted in one homeowner objecting, and the HOA might have survived purely out of procedural inertia. The reality is that many HOA conflicts exist not because of legal requirements, but because homeowners fail to communicate or act together. Our success hinged on clarity, honesty, and shared understanding. Before taking any major action, we ensured that everyone knew the plan in detail. Legal safeguards were explained, risks were evaluated, and each homeowner understood their role. We weren't acting rashly. We were acting strategically. Everyone knew that even if something went wrong, the emergency fund and deed restrictions provided protection. It was a rare combination of minimal risk and maximum benefit. The beauty of this situation was that dissolving the HOA didn't create chaos. No property was at risk. No one lost access to shared amenities. The park remained usable, the emergency fund remained secure, and the only remaining maintenance was a tiny strip of grass handled efficiently by one homeowner. This minimized any potential friction and ensured that no one had reason to challenge the decision. It was a low-risk, high-reward move executed with precision. Trust also meant shared responsibility. Each homeowner understood that the financial and practical obligations of the HOA now shifted back to us collectively. The emergency fund remained in a neutral third-party account to cover unforeseen expenses. If issues arose, we could address them informally without reverting to the formal, rigid structure of the HOA. The confidence that everyone would act responsibly made the risk negligible. Finally, this experience highlighted a critical truth. HOAs often exist because of human inertia rather than necessity. When people blindly follow rules or continue funding a system without questioning it, organizations grow unnecessarily powerful. But when a group acts strategically, transparently, and cooperatively, even seemingly permanent institutions can be restructured or removed entirely. In our case, trust, communication, and minimal risk combined to create a system where freedom and autonomy could replace bureaucracy and unnecessary expense. The final part of this journey was not just about money or legal victories. It was about reclaiming control, freedom, and peace of mind. The HOA, which had once dictated our obligations, collected monthly fees, and subtly influenced our day-to-day lives, was officially gone. No board, no president, no monthly dues, and no bureaucracy. For the first time in years, the neighborhood operated purely on trust, cooperation, and mutual understanding. Financially, the benefits were undeniable. Each household saved $280 per month, amounting to thousands of dollars per year. The emergency fund, carefully maintained in a neutral third-party account, provided security without the overhead or administrative burden of an HOA. Tasks like mowing a tiny strip of grass became trivial, integrated seamlessly into personal routines. The money and effort once lost to red tape were now retained by the homeowners, creating both tangible savings and emotional relief. Emotionally, the impact was just as profound. The stress of letters, rules, fines, and obligatory meetings disappeared. The neighborhood regained autonomy. Homeowners could make decisions collectively without relying on formal processes. Relationships improved because interactions were voluntary and genuine, not mediated by bureaucracy. The transformation went beyond finance. It touched quality of life and mental well-being. Looking back, the journey taught several critical lessons. First, knowledge is power, understanding. Legal obligations and financial structures is essential. Second, timing and opportunity matter, acting. strategically when circumstances align, can achieve results that seem impossible. Third, trust and cooperation are invaluable. Unanimous agreement and shared responsibility make complex actions feasible and low risk. And finally, small, deliberate actions can create outsized impact. Transferring the park, reviewing contracts, and choosing not to renew were all minor steps that collectively dismantled an entire institution. In the end, what seemed like an inevitable burden became a remarkable victory. We not only eliminated unnecessary costs and bureaucracy, but we also reclaimed our freedom as homeowners. The HOA, once a permanent fixture of our neighborhood, was gone, replaced by autonomy, savings, and peace of mind. And while it may sound simple in hindsight, it required patience, strategy, and careful execution. The result? A neighborhood free from unnecessary control, united in trust and thriving on its own terms. It was a rare victory, one most homeowners never experience. And yet, for those willing to study, plan, and act, it is absolutely possible. This story isn't just about an HOA, it's about taking control of your life, questioning systems, and recognizing that freedom often lies just beyond bureaucracy if you have the courage to seize it.